So the interwar period is the next unit that we're going to talk about. And there is so many different things going on between the two world wars, and you see a lot of them here in front of you. The Depression, of course, totalitarian leaders rise up all over the world. And then, of course, you have all the other things you probably already know about the Roaring Twenties and the downfall of America and many countries in the 1930s. So let's take a look at that whole uproarious period. First, we need to go back in time just a little bit to kind of set the stage for what's going to occur between these two world wars. So we have to look at the Treaty of Versailles. We talked about in the unit on World War I how Woodrow Wilson was the only one that went into the meeting at Versailles with the idea that we should make sure that we do everything we can to ensure peace in the future. Everyone else kind of went in there with vengeance in mind and set the stage for a future war. One of the things that they did to set the stage for wars throughout the world is that mandate system. And if you remember, one of the worst ones that we talked about was the fact that Britain and France were given so many countries in the Muslim world. And we'll talk a little bit more about that one in just a second. But I want to go back to Germany and the effects of the Treaty of Versailles directly related to them. Remember that the Versailles writers, Treaty of Versailles writers, made sure that Germany was embarrassed in front of the world. And one of the things that they did was to remove their military. And here's a country that is based on military. We talked about that very early in the year, how Frederick the Great had made Germany into this militaristic society, and that was their pride and joy, and they were stripped of it. And they had to tell the world that it was their fault when it was not really. And they also had to pay reparations that they absolutely could not afford. So we'll get more into the reparations in just a minute. I'm still kind of setting the stage. But just know that very bad things are happening in 1920s, 1930s, not just in America, but again across the world. And people started to look for alternate forms of government. They started to think that maybe the democratic idea was outdated and wasn't working anymore. And that's how a lot of these big bad guys are going to come into power all at the same time between those two world wars. As a historian, when you look back at just the evil, murderous rulers that got a hold of some of the largest countries and most powerful countries on the planet, it's really scary to think that that many men, evil men, were in control at the same time, and that the world kind of allowed that to happen. So that's a lot about what this unit is going to be about as well. Hopefully you recognize a lot of these leaders. Those that you don't, not a problem. We're going to come back to them. But these are pretty much the face of evil between the two world wars. And they are totalitarian leaders. In other words, they don't ask other people's advice. They rule with a single hand, and nobody questions them unless they're willing to die. So these are the people that are making names for themselves during the period between the two world wars. Now let's look at some of the causes of worldwide depression. This is one of the reasons that people all over the world are willing to seek alternative forms of political leadership, because if things aren't going well the way that they are, then change can't be too bad, right? I mean, it's got to be, you got to change to make things better. So people were willing to talk about socialism and communism, where before that was kind of a dirty word. It will be again in America in the 1950s, but all of a sudden alternate forms of political leadership don't seem so evil. And I knew I couldn't make it through one of these without my grandfather clock going off. So sorry about that. But look how smart I am. I rearranged the words on things that you need to know about the causes of the worldwide depression so that that first letters spell out crash. We're going to go into each one individually, so you really don't need to write them down right now. But if you think crash when you're trying to take the test, it might help you a little bit. So let's start with credit. Credit was kind of an American idea. It came about in the 1920s. That's when a lot of people started really using credit, and we decided that we would allow others across the planet to enjoy this wonderful new idea as well. So we had tons of new products coming out after World War I we got rich off of World War One, and we had a lot of industries that suddenly started booming everywhere because the people in Europe had lost so many men. Remember, they were in it for 3 years. We were only in it for one, and they had lost an entire generation of men in many of the cities. Factories were closing. People weren't producing. The men that did go home were encouraged to farm because the farms had gone fallow and nobody was growing food and they were starving to death. So we were pretty much producing everything that people needed across the world, including food. So we were kind of the leaders, and we were giving people all these great goods on credit. So that's kind of our idea. So once we start expanding credit all over the world and we start having money problems in the late 1920s, we start calling in our debts. So the money problems that we are having, we lie on the shoulders of countries all across the world, take money from them. It still isn't enough to help us, but now we've caused money problems in those countries as well. So this whole thing about the depression worldwide is very much a snowball effect. So let's see what else. Reparations made by Germany. We talked about how Woodrow Wilson really thought this was a bad idea. Germany at the time, let me tell you a little bit about what the German civilians were living through. The soldiers' lives were bad enough, not quite as bad as the Russian soldiers, but they were pretty bad. The citizens at home, very, very sad story. They were to the point where they would take clothing and take it to a tailor, and the tailor would basically take your clothes apart and make two out of the one thing. So if you had a suit and you wanted somebody in your family needed a suit, you would take the one and kind of pull the threads apart to make two very, very fragile suits that didn't last very long. It was expensive to make, but they were so poor they literally did not have enough clothing to go around. Children 5 and under pretty much went naked. If you had something to cover a person up, it needed to go to an adult before it did a child who wasn't embarrassed by their nakedness. So even clothing, I mean, imagine being so poor that you do not know how you're going to keep the shirt on your back literally. It also became illegal through Kaiser Wilhelm to throw anything away. Absolutely everything had a purpose to be reused, even if it was just to go into the compost heap and turned into vitamins and minerals for the soils. You were not allowed to throw things away. Garbage collection was stopped because there wasn't supposed to be any garbage collection. So Germany was not doing very well at all. The only meat they really had, for the most part, was fish and tuna, and they would actually mix it all together with sawdust sometimes and sell it as beef. So that's how bad it was. And here we're asking them to pay billions in reparations. So America asked these two young financial wizards, Dawes and Young, to come up with a plan for us to help the Germans. Young kind of dropped out of the plan, so most often you'll hear it as the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act simply was this plan that linked all the major countries across the world to one another in a way that we had never been linked before. So the United States would give money to Germany on a regular basis so that Germany could pay their bill to the Allies. Well, the Allies also owed the United States money. We had built lots of things for them during the war. We had loaned them ships. We had loaned them men before we were actually involved in the war. They owed us quite a bit of money. So the Allies took the money from Germany to pay us. And we took that money and gave it to Germany, and Germany gave it to the Allies, and the Allies gave it back to us. So it was like that we were floating money, basically, which works until one of the parties involved starts to have financial problems and can't pay it forward. And that country happened to be the United States. So we're the ones that created the Dawes Plan that linked everybody economically, but we're also going to be the ones that fall out of that link first. And again, it's that snowball effect that once we can't make payments, Germany can't make payments, the Allies can't make payments, and now no money is coming in, no money's going out, and it's just a mess for everyone. We also had a habit during this time period between the two world wars to lend countries money, not a bill for goods, just to loan them money. You need a hospital, you need schools, you need roads rebuilt, whatever. We just handed out money. We kind of looked at it as if we were their bank, the we were the leader over them, and it showed our how great we were, made us the boss kind of. So we lent money to a lot of people, and the minute that we started having problems, and we're falling out of the Dawes Act, losing that link in line, we realized it immediately, and we started reaching out to people who had taken loans from the United States and said, we want our money back now. There were no laws against it. Even here at home, the banks were doing the same thing to individual citizens, saying, I want my money now. And there was no law against it. You were allowed to do that. So America, not only the countries that we were linked with through the Dawes Act, but countries we had loaned money to or given credit to buy goods, now all of a sudden we're reaching out to them saying, give me whatever you have. And now they're destitute. And again, it still is not going to be enough to get us out from underneath all the problems, economic problems that are suddenly surrounding us. But we brought other people down with us, as is sometimes the way. The crash of the stock market actually comes near the end of the beginning of the Great Depression. Most people think that the stock market crash started the Great Depression. That's absolutely not true. Think about after World War I. Well, during World War I and after, our farmers here in America were in high demand in markets across the world. Most of the modernized countries had most of their men off fighting the war, and they couldn't grow crops. And even after the war, so many men died that there still were not enough men around to grow enough crops to feed people. So during the war and after the war, these foreign countries bought lots and lots of goods from our farmers. But the farther away the war became, the less need there was for foreign countries to buy from our farmers. They were starting to heal and grow their own food. So the first group in America that really started to feel the depression was not the rich. It was not men who were able to afford to buy stock. It was the farmers. And the farmers started to stumble when the banks realized that there were some serious economic problems. They reached out to the people who they had loans with and said, we want our money now. And when the farmers couldn't pay it, then they lost their land. And when all the farmers had lost their land and there was nobody left to pay their monthly bills, the banks started to close. So those people will grab for whatever they can, and it just became like a domino effect where bank after bank after bank started to close down. Nobody has money to pay. Nobody has money to lend. So that's happening in America, but it's also happening in a global way. And again, America kind of led the way in that. It was sort of our fault for loaning money and handing out credit to all these countries for all these years, and then suddenly saying, well, we want it back right now. Doesn't work that way. The worst thing that came out of this end of the beginning of the Depression was something called the Hawley-Smoot Act. And Mr. Hawley and Mr. Smoot are those two lovely characters that you see here at the top right-hand side of your screen. I always think that they should be like those cartoon crows from Disney. Is it Disney? They weren't very intelligent when it came to their ideas, but they decided to approach President Hoover, who wasn't too smart about this either, to approach President Hoover and say, look, people want American goods, but they also want to bring things to our country. People are building now. Industry is coming to life. So if they want to trade with America, let's charge them an astronomically high tax to get their stuff to us. When they arrive at our ports, we're going to charge them taxes up to 60%. 60%. Not a very smart idea. So Hawley, Smoot, and Hoover all think we're going to make tons of money off this, but really what happened was all the countries that got word of this 60% tax to go to America, they started charging 60% tax to everybody. Retaliatory taxes all over the world. If America can do it, everybody can do it. And effectively, this Hawley-Smoot Act shut down trade. It completely shut it down. So no trade, no money coming in. Our country strangled trade across the world. Now I want to take a step back and just tell you a little bit about President Hoover. He kept denying that there was a depression. Every once in a while, he would come up with a little idea to alleviate the issues in the economy. That's kind of how he put it, to alleviate the problem. But this problem was not going to be easily fixed. And Hoover was actually a financial genius. He had traveled all over the world and solved hunger problems. In Africa, he had taken flood victims in a few towns across America and helped them to rebuild, and gave them a financial plan to do so. So you would think that this man, being the financial wizard that he was and the planner that he was, could have stepped into the Great Depression and fixed it, or done something to at least keep us afloat like FDR will. But Hoover just kept denying that there was a problem until the effects of the Hawley-Smoot Act was truly realized. And by then it was too late. People hated him. At some point, he went to I think it was the New York Yankees game. I'm pretty sure it was New York Yankees game, and he was supposed to throw the first ball. And the minute he stepped on the mound, people started throwing rotten tomatoes at him, and he had to leave the field. Secret Service were afraid that he was going to be injured. They pulled him off the field. He didn't leave the White House very often after that. Once he realized there truly was a problem, then he's going to kick it into gear and come up with some master plans. But again, no one's going to listen to him, especially after this Hawley-Smoot Act. He is so hated by the public. It's just unbelievable. So when FDR comes to power, Hoover actually calls him quite a bit and says, hey, I came up with this financial plan. You might want to give it a try, but don't tell anybody it came from me. Hoover was wise enough to know that if his name was attached to it, America would poo-poo the idea no matter how good it was. So he gave FDR permission to claim it as his own. Now, I'm not trying to say that FDR didn't do anything, but a lot of the ideas that he came up with was either straight from Hoover, or it was a plan encouraged by ideas of Hoover. Few people realize that, but Hoover was a smart guy. He just, for some reason, just wasn't willing to admit that there was a Great Depression until it was too late. So this high tariff, the Hawley-Smoot Act, was kind of the icing on the cake. Now, sometimes I just want to forewarn you, because I can't remember how your book uses the name. Hawley and Smoot are interchangeable. Sometimes you'll see it as the Hawley-Smoot Act. Sometimes you'll see it as the Smoot-Hawley Act, because it's two men's names, so they just use them interchangeably. So don't let it confuse you if you do read it as Hawley-Smoot or Smoot-Hawley. So that's the story of President Hoover's downfall. So let's take a look at some changes taking place all over the world. And I love this picture. I know it's a little bit blurry. It's the best I could get it. But I wanted you to see that the two most evil men on the planet, Stalin and Hitler, are standing in the forefront. Are they evil? Yes, they are. But I like this picture because it has FDR and Churchill standing behind them. FDR and Churchill are not innocent. They are in no way evil and murderous the way that Stalin and Hitler are. But I don't want you to think that they are innocent little bystanders that don't do anything wrong. So keep that in mind as we travel out of this time period into World War II later. You'll see FDR and Churchill's colors kind of come out a little bit. Here in America, we kind of got the idea that we need to change all around the place. And we started looking for little points of interest that might make our society better and give us happier lives. So in 1929, this picture was taken. The Prohibition Act had gone into effect, of course, with the 18th Amendment. And this is actually like policemen had gone up into this brothel and they were pouring alcohol out the windows. So now prohibition will be done away with with the 21st Amendment a few years later. But they're looking for a solution. And women were kind of in charge of this. Women said that their men became abusive when they drank, so it broke up the family home. They spent money on alcohol rather than on their families. That was breaking up the home. So society kind of got together and said, we need a stable family unit. Things are falling apart. So we have to get rid of things that threaten our family, and alcohol is one of them. So here in America, that's a huge change for us to make alcohol illegal. This is also a time period where we start focusing on kind of the fantastic. I'm sure that you've seen articles or read articles that are just crazy. I remember reading one time about how disco dancing caused cancer, colon cancer, and people were all upset and worried about it. That's, it's not true. But in the 1920s and 1930s is when you start getting those fantastic stories, and it was a way to redirect people's attention from the really bad everyday things that were happening. So these yellow journalists, or these journalists that kind of stretch the truth, number one, to get people to buy their newspapers or magazines because money's tight. So it's got to be something pretty juicy for people to be willing to go spend, their nickel to buy a newspaper. And it's got to be something that will take people's minds off of the everyday. So this is just one of them that I wanted you to see how fantastic it was. This story went around saying that babies were dying because they were not getting enough sunshine, that too many people, farmers, had left their land and they're coming into the cities, and the babies are growing up in the dark and they're all unhealthy and they're dying. Of course, none of that was true, but they decided to build this lovely little contraption where you put the baby in a cage and hang it outside the window 13, 14 stories up. To me, I think I would rather my child had a little bit of a lack of sunshine rather than sitting in a cage all those stories up. So I just showed you this because I wanted you to realize how fantastic the stories became, and we kind of got wrapped up in that idea of the fantastic and the overboard, and of course the love of movies and stuff like that is going to come into play as well. So where you have all these bad things happening, you have this media is starting to come to life, media of all sorts, including the theater and things like that too. So big change in America. All right, so let's look at actual leadership changes across the world. First, we're going to look at the Middle East, and this is just a reminder. We talked about that in World War I. When the Ottoman Empire disintegrated at the end of World War I, of course, a lot of these countries that had joined the League of Nations decided that they had to fill that void for the colonies that no longer had a country to control them. It was kind of like they had lost their mommy. The colonies lost their mother countries. So this mandate system was developed by the League of Nations to keep peace and to smooth things out. And of course, that is absolutely not what happens in a lot of the places. And you have the Israeli Jews versus the Palestinian Arabs in Palestine or Israel. And remember, we talked about the Gaza Strip and all that stuff. So it starts with that World War I decision to create the mandate system, and it disrupted the entire Middle East, and it's still being disrupted today. So I love the cartoon at the bottom because both sides, you can see a Jewish man on one side and a Arab on the other side, and they're both saying, will they ever stop? They could just as easily be saying, will they ever apologize for what they did? Because both believe they are right and the other one is wrong, and I don't see it changing anytime soon. But that was rehashed because of the mandate system and Britain deciding to drop a bunch of fresh Jews into Palestine, and it got that 1,000-year-old argument going again. All right, the next one is a little bit longer than the Middle East, and that is the story of Russia and what's going on with Russia. Remember, Russia pulled out of World War I in 1917, and the reason that they did was because of the Russian Revolution. But there's a little bit more to it than that. There were things that led up to the Russian Revolution. It didn't just happen overnight. And these four things that I have here are the four major things that ended up contributing to the Russian Revolution and bringing it to a head. First thing is the defeat in 1905 in the Russo-Japanese War. Remember, the Japanese were kind of seen during this time period as tiny, weak, innocent little people that couldn't hurt a fly, but they just suddenly one day decided to go to Mongolia and run the Russians out, and they won. And it was a very quick win, and it totally, completely embarrassed the Russians. So they blamed their leader, of course, Tsar Nicholas, for allowing this to happen. The military defeat in World War One wasn't they didn't say, hey, Germany wins, we lose. They actually had to pull out. And of all the soldiers in World War One, it was the Russian soldiers who were the worst off. They were so bad off that many of them were fighting barefoot by the time that they pulled out in 1917. Most of them did not have weapons anymore. They would scrounge from the bodies of the dead in no man's land to get whatever they could. And they were so destitute that their enemies actually fed them quite often. They would bring food into their trenches because they couldn't stand to hear the men moaning and just wailing with hunger. So that was pretty embarrassing too. Tsar Nicholas as their leader is just, we'll get into him a little bit more later in this lesson, but he was very incompetent, and people in Russia were very aware of his incompetence. So we'll go back to him a little bit later. Landless peasantry is a huge issue because a lot of people lost their land or had been promised land if they helped in World War One, and then when the war was ended, they didn't get it. So landless peasantry is kind of a little tiny phrase to encompass a lot of people, but basically it's poor people. It's people who, for whatever reason, wanted land and couldn't have it, weren't going to get it. So landless peasantry is the poor people who are going to rise up and create a revolution against their leadership. So let's look at the next step here. This is a picture that was developed during the time period of the Russian Revolution, and it says it perfectly. You have that landless peasantry at the bottom, and they're being crushed and danced upon, walked on by the upper class, who's totally unaware of them until they start breaking through the floor. You can see the man's fist going through the floor, and now they realize, oh my goodness, we've been stamping on people. So it's a perfect representation of the rich versus the poor, and the rich totally unaware until the poor, get right in their face and say, look, we need to fix something. So I just thought it was a neat picture. All right, also in Russia, we need to talk about a man named Rasputin. Now, the Romanovs, that's the family name for Tsar Nicholas and his whole family, and you see him sitting here. He actually looked a whole lot like King George of England. They looked almost like twins. But there is Tsar Nicholas, and you see Alexandra there behind his shoulder. They have 4 daughters and 1 son, Alexei. And if you look at the smallest daughter here, she is Anastasia. So you probably heard the stories of Anastasia. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But know the Romanovs is Tsar Nicholas's family, and know the name Rasputin. All right, let's talk about how Rasputin is going to bring down the royal family. The Alexandra, the wife of Tsar Nicholas, really wanted a son, wanted to give her husband a son. And she has 4 children that are female. And every time she gives birth to another one, Queen Victoria of England, who is, her grandmother-in-law, writes these horrible letters to her about, oh my goodness, how could you have another girl? How sad that is. Maybe God is not smiling on you. I mean, it's just made Alexandra feel horrible. So Alexandra actually went to a couple of mystics to try and get them to get her to have a baby boy with like magical potions and powders and whatever. So she had a background of believing in mystics and things like that. And Tsar Nicholas actually let her kind of delve into that, and he went with her a few times. And so when they do have a baby boy, they give credit to a mystic that they had been involved with during her pregnancy. That man mysteriously disappears. I can't remember his name, but just know that they were already involved with that kind of thing, like believing in mystics. And Rasputin shows up. He has a very different way about him. He seems very mysterious, and they just think that he's like worldly, and the truth of it is that he was actually an opium addict. The guy was high all the time. but the way that he spoke, and he had this stare about him that just pierced right through you, that made you feel like he knew something about you that you didn't want anybody to know. He was just that kind of persona, and people fell in under his spell. If you look at this picture here, these are actually very high society people, and you notice that most of them are women. Rasputin, till his end, Rasputin convinced these high society people that having sex with him would ensure good luck. Their wishes would come true, basically, is what he said. And it wasn't just one or two of them having sexual encounters here or there. He actually convinced them to have orgies together, men and women, mostly women, which is bad enough in itself. But this guy was disgusting. He did not bathe. His table manners were atrocious. His favorite food was fish stew, but he refused to eat with any utensils at all. He used his hands. And of course, it got stuck in that lovely beard that you see of him sitting in the middle there. And he never cleaned it. He smelled like rotten fish all the time. And he's going to have a orgy with these people. Yeah, he was nasty. But he swore to the royal family that he could help their son, Alexei. Alexei was born a hemophiliac. And if you don't know what that is, that's if you have hemophilia, you have issues with blood clotting. Your blood doesn't clot like a normal person's blood does, and you can actually bleed to death. Even a bruise can cause internal bleeding, and it's painful. That blood builds up underneath of the skin, and it's painful to touch. Think about just a regular bruise, how painful that can be sometimes. But this is actually blood pooling under your skin. Very painful. And Alexandra knew that that hemophilia ran in the family. And by this time period, they already understood that hemophilia comes from the mother's bloodline, but girls very rarely get it. They usually give it to their sons. They carry the gene, but it actually comes to fruition in the sons. So it's usually the sons who are hemophiliacs. And Alexandra, the whole time she's praying for her son, realizes this, but she wants to give her husband a boy. He's a czar. He needs to have an heir. So she prays for the boy. She finally gets one, and she's waiting for some kind of sign to see, is he going to be okay or not. And he was old enough that his umbilical cord was starting to fall off. And the lady who was taking care of him, the nanny, accidentally got the umbilical cord kind of caught on a piece of clothing, and it was almost off, but a little tiny shred of skin was still attached. And when she pulled on it, it pulled the umbilical cord off, and the poor baby just bled and bled and bled and bled. So of course they realized that he had hemophilia. So they protected him as much as they could. His whole life, they do all kinds of experimental things to this poor little child. For one thing, they gave him aspirin. They didn't realize that it was a blood thinner. So here's a child whose blood won't clot, and you're giving him aspirin, thinning his blood. They also put leeches on him. Whenever he had a really bad bruise where it was pulling under his skin, they would put leeches on him to draw the blood out. But they were making him bleed, not only on the inside, but on the outside now. And it just was people always around him and doing tests on him, and he never got to sleep because they were always just hovering over him. And Rasputin swore that he could cure him. So basically what really happened is he walked into the room and told everyone to get out. He didn't want anybody in the room but he and Alexei, and he was going to cure him. So Rasputin's cures included taking the aspirin out of Alexei's diet and basically just leaving him alone, letting him rest. Of course, he got rid of the leeches. He just basically took away all the things that were totally stressing Alexei out and let the kid get some sleep, let him rest. And of course, he got better very quickly. He's still a hemophiliac, but he looks so much better. And the royal family was tricked into believing that he was the voice of God. So they allowed him a lot of political intervention. He came to Nicholas one day and said, the reason that we are doing so badly in the war, World War I is what he's referring to, is because your men have lost faith in you. And the only way to restore it, the only way to win this war, is for you to go to the front lines. Well, it seemed like Rasputin was right about everything else, so Nicholas and Alexandra believed him, and Nicholas headed to the front lines. Rasputin was really hoping he would get killed. The kings didn't go to the front lines anymore. That's a medieval thing. They stayed back where it was nice and safe and cushy, but he went to the front lines. Of course, he made an idiot of himself while he was there. He definitely was not a soldier. But while he was gone, Rasputin put his own men in governmental offices. Alexander allowed him to go through these governmental offices and just get rid of people who were great at their jobs, but they weren't Rasputin's opium buddies, and that's who he put in there. And she allowed him to do it. And it became very obvious very quickly to the Russian people that the Russian government was infected with bribery, inexperienced leaders. Just nothing was going the way that it should be for a country who kept saying they were going to be a strong country again. So they just kept getting kind of embarrassed nationally or internationally. So Rasputin, in the end, he finally is going to be targeted for assassination. Not by the royal family, but by some of these upper government people. They poisoned him. They held a dinner and poisoned him, but he had so much opium in his body that it barely even made him sick, so that didn't work. They stabbed him, and he survived. They shot him point blank and thought he was dead, and the next day, guess who showed up? Rasputin. So they finally, after everything else they did to the guy, they finally bound his feet and hands and tied basically a brick type object to him and threw him in the icy cold water. And he never came back. So we assumed that probably finally did him in. So Rasputin died screaming that he was going to come back for revenge, scared the crap out of everybody, but he was finally gone. All right, so let's take another little step back and think about why, while all this is going on, they're losing World War I. It's an embarrassment to the world, in front of the world, I should say. Nicholas is on the front lines making a jerk of himself. Rasputin is at home, probably betting Alexandra, and making a mess of the government. And on top of all of that, people started to turn to the Communist Manifesto and Karl Marx, because he was preaching to them, workers of the world unite. You don't have anything to lose but your chains. So he's telling the poor people, that landless peasantry, to rise up against this injustice of being stepped on by the rich. Rise up and do something about it. So you have this kind of mentality coming up on top of everything else that was going wrong, and let's see how that culminates into something very, very bad. All right, so the Russian Revolution is going to take place in 1917. We talked about that in World War I. The Russian Revolution was not like the American Revolution, where it was just one long battle, boom, it's over. It was a series of revolutions for different reasons, but they were all on top of each other. And after the very first revolution, a temporary government took over, and the royal family was imprisoned in a castle. They weren't beaten or starved or anything like that. They were just kept imprisoned. But Tsar Nicholas understood what this meant. He knew that his family was probably not going to make it out of this captivity, and he actually secretly sent letters to King George of England, his cousin. Even to Kaiser Wilhelm, who was now, in exile, sent letters to him. Help us. Please help us. They're going to kill us. Please help us. If you can't help me, help my children. No response from anybody. They basically left them there to die. And in 1918, a year later, the royal family was taken down to the basement of the castle with all their kind of close confidants, including the nannies of the children. And quite a few people were taken into that basement, and they were all just mowed down, all shot. This is where you get the myth of Anastasia. Anastasia is the youngest girl you see in the picture here, and some people claimed at the time that she was a favorite of all the guards of the temporary, sent by the temporary government. She was kind of a tomboy, real sweet kid. You used to sneak them candy and things like that, and she was a favorite. So the myth went that they kind of put her in the middle of the group, and as the dead bodies started to fall, they fell on her and protected her. And then when the guys, making the order for the hit left the room, they went in and got Anastasia and led her to safety. Another myth is that Alexandra had instructed all the girls to sew jewels into their gowns. So if they escaped, they would have some kind of thing to exchange or make money. And the jewels that Anastasia was wearing actually ricocheted the bullets off of her. I find that very hard to believe that that would ever happen. But anyway, there were quite a few young ladies that claimed to be Anastasia years later, but the bones and remains of the Russian family has been found, and they've done DNA, and she did die with them in the basement. Her bones was with the bones of the rest of her family. So the temporary government, after the first revolution in Russia, killed the royal family. So the Bolsheviks, who were founded by Vladimir Lenin, they were a part of the upper echelon of the political entity. Vladimir Lenin led this group called the Bolsheviks, and once they overthrew Tsar Nicholas and killed the royal family, now they have to decide what kind of leadership are they going to have. And the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin said, we want to be communist. Well, that started another revolution. So it's the Bolsheviks versus everybody else that is in this upper political body in Russia. Don't really have a ruler at this moment. It's the Bolsheviks fighting everybody else that's part of the political body. And, of course, the Bolsheviks are going to win. So they're going to be communist. Or they're going to head down the path of communism, I should say. They're not communist overnight. But now you have another problem. You have all these Bolsheviks. But some of the Bolsheviks said, why don't we make some independent nations here? Like where I'm from, in the area that I'm representing, we want independence from Russia. We don't want to stay part of this nation. This is a good time to kind of break free. So the whites were saying, why don't we go and ask territories, do they want to be part of Russia or do they want to have their independence? But the Reds said, no, we need to keep our country intact. So it's the white Bolsheviks versus the red Bolsheviks. And now you move out of revolution into civil war. So the Russians are fighting themselves, an actual civil war. And you can see here that it lasted from 1917 to 1923. This war, the series of revolutions, and then the Civil War itself. So it's red versus white, and of course red wins. That's why whenever you see anything Russian, it's red. The Reds won, and Lenin took full control of the government and headed down the path of communism. So 1921, Lenin realized that communism wasn't going to work for some groups in society. They had a real problem with feeding their people. They had for a very, very long time. And he knew that the farmers were different. He had to keep them happy. He had to make them want to grow good crops for reasons other than just feeding their people. So there's no incentive. You're not going to make any money. You're going to kill yourself, working yourself to death. You're the most important people in society. But what's the point of doing all that? So Lenin created this idea called the New Economic Policy. And this economic policy, now remember, this is supposed to be communism. It's kind of it's evolving into communism. It's not quite there yet. It's evolving. But the New Economic Policy was definitely not communism. It actually allowed the peasants to keep crop surplus and sell it for profit. Now remember, in communism is totally classless. You have the government telling you what to do, where to live, how much money you're allowed to have, how much food you're allowed to have. Everybody's supposed to be equal. But suddenly you have the group of farmers are allowed to have profit and have extra money in their pocket. So it does encourage them to work, and the crops multiply unbelievably. So some people thought it was a wonderful plan, that the New Economic Policy was just genius. But other people said, look, we fought a revolution and a civil war against our own people so that we could become communist, and now you're doing something that's totally not communist. So some people absolutely loved this Stalin. Some people did not like him. Or Lenin, sorry, loved Lenin. Some people did not like him at all. So Lenin's going to have a stroke in 1922. So he's not really a huge part of this for a very long time. He gets it started, but he's not well after 1922. It's 2 years really of people watching and waiting for him to die and kind of scrambling around behind his back, stabbing each other in the back to take over leadership. And of course, he's going to die in 1924, and Stalin is going to take his place as the leader of the Communist Party. All right, you may not know this, but Lenin to this day is actually enclosed in glass in Russia, and you can go see him. It's a casket, but it's glass, so you can walk right up to it, and lots of people do. It costs the country millions of dollars because it's of course sealed, but it has special gases that are pumped into it continuously to keep him alive. Now remember, keep him alive looking. He's been dead since 1924, and this is a picture that was just taken in the last couple years. He still looks this good. So once in a while, I think once or twice a year, they have to take him out of his glass coffin and they have to soak him in this solution to kind of keep him, I don't want to say agile, but to keep him from becoming totally rigid, where he'll just poof, disintegrate into ash. So they have to bathe him inside and out. Of course, all his organs have been removed, but they have to soak him in this solution and scrub him down to get rid of any flakiness. And they actually kind of put fillers in as well. So if he is starting to kind of flake away, they put fillers in him. It's disgusting. So this picture you can kind of see, I included it because you can see what's happening to his feet. And they're really worried about his hands because you can see his feet almost look like wood. They don't want that to happen to his hands because you can see his hands. So this is one of the reasons that they pull him out, his hands and his face. They want to keep it kind of elastic looking to keep the hope of a new country and how a country can rebuild itself. That's kind of what it is. They're paying an honor to him for bringing their country out of darkness. So, but again, Russia's not economically strong, and this costs a lot of money. So there are people that are starting to question how smart this really is, but who knows what's going to happen. All right, so let's turn to Stalin. Stalin was the guy who actually turned Russia into the Soviet Union. He is hardcore communist, and he has his own little plan. Like Lenin had the new economic policy, Stalin has a couple of 5-year plans. And in 5 years, he wants to completely collectivize all farms, which means no individual is allowed to own a farm at all. Nobody. And he's going to turn them into big collectives where you all work together, you share the same equipment. Of course, the government will own that equipment, and you just work for the government. The land is all theirs. Everything is theirs. He wanted to do the same thing with industry. So he's going to turn them into works of the government rather than anybody personally owning anything, and he wants to do that in a 5-year plan.
In Russian, Stalin means man of steel. The Soviet Union's communist leader Joseph Stalin certainly lived up to his name. During his rule, the Soviet Union achieved unprecedented power, but at the cost of freedom for its people. He launched a brutal transformation of Soviet agriculture through collectivization, forcibly taking over privately owned land, creating a system of state-owned farms. He also took control of manufacturing and production, creating huge government-controlled industries. Stalin created a police state in which anyone who disagreed with the government's policies could be arrested and sent to labor camps in Siberia. In 1930, Stalin began the Big Purge. So-called enemies of the people were arrested and executed. Historians estimate between 8 to 13 million people were killed. By 1939, Stalin had firmly established a totalitarian communist government with complete control over its citizens. All opposition was crushed.
All right, let's talk about the secret police. He's the one that invented the KGB, the Great Terror of the 1930s. And mostly he did that because he wanted them to carry out his evil plans. He was all about spying on people. And if he thought that you did something horrible, then he would send you to the Gulag, which is in Siberia. Very, very slim chance that you're ever coming home again. If you got sent to the Gulag, it was pretty much a death sentence. We used to think that Hitler was the guy who killed the most people in history, but all around the Gulag, whenever there is any chance of a thaw, people go dig. Their government goes and digs, and they have found so many bodies that he has definitely exceeded Hitler. He is the #1 killer on the planet because of all the people that were killed in the Gulag. Now, this massive undertaking to get rid of people who he was afraid of, or who challenged him, or might know his dirty little secrets. Getting rid of those people was called the Great Purge. He went through all of Russia and basically purged anyone who was against him in any way whatsoever. All right, so Russia's genocide. It is called a genocide. It's called the Great Purge. Make sure you got that. Here's some of the people that he targeted. And you can see from the list, it didn't matter what social class you were or what position you held in society, peasant to military leaders to the very super rich. If you did something to upset him or make him fearful, you were gone. And that was the end of that. And he was so extreme about wiping people from the planet. Not just killing you, goodbye, you're buried, no one will ever find you. He wanted them wiped. And he actually had professional photographers go in and touch up pictures. So if he wanted the picture for some reason, but he wanted a person removed from it because he had eliminated them for whatever reason, he could still have the photo. And this is one of those photos that we found, that he's with a man and then he's not with a man. So we don't know who that little guy is because he's been wiped from the planet. But apparently he was some hush-hush secret related to Stalin. But who knows what that is. One of the worst things that Stalin did, other than just the general purge and the mass killings through the Gulag, is the genocide in the Ukraine. And I'm going to have you go ahead and watch these two links. It says part 1 and part 2, but they're actually part 2 and part 6. I just want you to watch them in that order. And basically the background behind it is that when Stalin moved in and told people to give up their land, some people said no. Some people tried to fight back. And a large majority of them were Ukrainian people who refused to give him their grain. And they suffered unbelievably because of this decision. So I'm going to let you watch so you can get an idea. Some of it is just heart-wrenching, I'm going to warn you, but it'll really tell the story better than I can. So do part 1 and then part 2, and see you on the next slide.
During the day, people would hide. You couldn't see them anywhere. But at night, they would come out, like shadows, lining up in front of the bread stores, hoping maybe to get some bread in the morning. Only homeless children could be seen walking in the streets. Homeless children and starving women in rags, and dead bodies, children stepping over them. That's how the city of Kharkiv looked then.
It is hard to imagine how long those lines were for the so-called commercial bread. They lined up by the 1,000, or 2, or 3, and even as many as 7,000.
Andor Henke was the German consul stationed in Kiev. He and his family witnessed the horrors of the famine firsthand.
I ran out of the consulate because the Russian newspapers were reporting that there was a famine in Germany, but that everything was wonderful in Russia. I became very angry and took pictures of the corpses.
Da habe ich die Wut gekriegt und habe fotografiert.
Doch ich habe also noch eine relativ lebhafte Erinnerung an die Zeit in Kiew.
I still have a very vivid memory of that time in Kiev. We were children at the time. My sister was 4 years younger than I. We lived in the consulate like in a golden cage. We weren't allowed to go out in the streets alone during this time. Nevertheless, I remember the misery and the famine very well. I remember seeing bodies everywhere, in doorways, on street corners. Wagons would take them away. They were picked up, thrown in, and driven away.
Aufgeladen, aufgeschmissen und abtransportiert.
Some of them were still alive, but they were all thrown on a pile and taken out of the city and thrown into a pit and covered with earth. The children, teenagers, girls, boys, went along stumbling and falling and begging for bread. I couldn't take it. I went home and I screamed and cried hysterically.
We survived thanks to parishioners, the railroad employees who had the chance to travel beyond the borders of Ukraine. And we had neighbors, Soviet officials. They always had food. We came through their garbage cans. We eat rotten potatoes, rotten cabbage and beets, and the scraps of food which they threw away. I am not ashamed to admit it, because it was a matter of survival. I didn't want to die.
When we reached the state farm and met the manager, he hired us to work there. He told us we would work at night, feeding the horses linseed cakes mixed with chopped straw. He said we should do this when people are asleep, because if they were awake, they would eat the horses' fodder. We said, how can we do that? People are more important than horses. But he said, we need the horses to cart the corpses away. They collected the corpses from the houses. A deep sleigh would stop at every house, and the men would ask, "You have any?" "Thank God, we have none." Then they'd stop at the next house. "Have you got any?" "Yes." "Well, bring them out." "But I don't have the strength." Then 2 or 3 young men, themselves with swollen legs, would go into the house, bring out the corpse, and place it in the sleigh. They'd collect 2, 3, 4 a day.
In the spring, when my little sister died, her body lay in the house a whole week. We kept it until Mother came back from the state farm. People would come to our house and knock on the door every day, asking whether we had any corpses. We'd shout, "No, we don't." Then the wagon would continue down the street collecting corpses. When Mother came home, we had to bury my sister. How could we bury her? There was nothing for a coffin. We wrapped her in a sheet, placed her on a sled, and took her to the cemetery. We put her between two coffins in a big grave. Coffins were placed on top also. And that's how we buried her.
Half a world away, kinsmen of the famine victims voice protests and form relief committees. Help is offered from Canada, the United States, Switzerland, France, Belgium. Cardinal Initzer initiates relief in Austria, Metropolitan Sheptytsky in western Ukraine. But all shipments of food grind to a halt at the Soviet border. The Soviet Red Cross flatly denies the existence of famine. The hands of the international organization are tied. Metropolitan Mstislav was then a deputy in the Polish parliament. He helped to organize relief efforts by Ukrainians living under Polish rule.
Our attempts to ship the grain into Ukraine were coordinated through the Soviet embassy in Warsaw. They told us this was not in their jurisdiction and that they would relay the request to the central government in Moscow. But Moscow's communications to us were, "What are you doing? Why would we need grain? We have had a wonderful harvest. There is no famine of any kind. This is nothing but anti-Soviet propaganda, that's all." So they gave us no hope of any kind that the grain would ever get there.
Spring 1933. The man-made famine reaches its height. 25,000 are dying every day, 1,000 an hour, 17 human beings every minute.
They tried to fool the people, telling them the famine was from natural causes. But the people saw that the famine was not from natural causes. No matter how hard they tried to hide the grain sealed inside mills and silos, people somehow found out there was plenty of grain, but they wouldn't give out any. Most of the grain was inside state mills. They were filled, and nobody was allowed near them. Some of it was piled high in the yard in sacks, covered with canvas, and it just rotted away. When I came to Mehedjuka that first time, all the bushes were still green, but when I came back, there was not a single leaf left. They ate it all. You couldn't hear a dog bark in the village, because they were eaten also.
We were told, "Children, it's very dangerous to go begging for food from house to house now.
By 1928, Stalin is a law unto himself. This efficient, ruthless administrator has eliminated all effective opposition within the Politburo. The dream of a worldwide communist revolution has not materialized. As Stalin strengthens communism within the borders of the USSR, Russian nationalism is increasingly injected into his policies. The strong cultural individuality of Ukraine is no longer tolerated. 1929. Stalin strikes at the nation's heart and mind. its church and intelligentsia. Over the next few years, the systematic liquidation of intellectuals is carried out by the communist regime in Ukraine. 5,000 scholars, scientists, poets, and artists prominent during Ukraine's independence are arrested for allegedly belonging to the SVU, a secret organization the Soviets claim is planning an armed insurrection. Only 45 get a public trial. No evidence is considered necessary. Thousands upon thousands are imprisoned, deported, and executed later as mass arrests continue throughout the 30s. Even the church is accused of involvement in this alleged plot.
Many priests were arrested. Many were sent to Siberian concentration camps. Many shot. My father was one of them. He never came back. I know this from personal experience. 30 bishops were murdered. Thousands of priests were perished. 100,000 of faithful were liquidated. Metropolitan Vasily Lipkivsky and his two successors were arrested too. To this day, we don't know what happened to them.
The church was full of people. Some communists rode inside on horseback and ordered me to undress. It was March. There was snow outside. The snow was melting, and I walked in water up to my knees while they rode on horseback. They interrogated me, but I didn't answer their questions. And for this, I was rewarded with pistol blows across my back.
They began taking down the icons and smashing them on the ground. The people wanted to go inside the church, but they didn't let them. They ruined everything, smashed everything in the church. And the people stood outside crying because they couldn't do anything. When a man went up to remove the bell, and that bell fell to the ground and rang out, all the people burst into tears. Everyone was weeping and saying goodbye to the bell, because that was the last time that bell rang.
By 1930, only the Russian Orthodox Church remains. In October 1928, Stalin introduces a drastic 5-year plan to transform the Soviet Union from a backward rural society into a modern, self-sufficient industrial empire, virtually overnight. Military defense takes priority. Socialism must be protected from all future enemies. Western technology is urgently needed. To pay for it, Stalin must seize the only exportable resource, grain. And so he decrees the compulsory collectivization of agriculture. Henceforth, all private lands, livestock, and farming implements will belong to the state. The farmer will work as a laborer for pay, like a worker in a factory.
One of the intriguing elements in the Ukraine was that it brought together both the peasant question and the nationality question in a way that was somewhat different than in other areas. Because in the Ukraine, Ukrainians tended to concentrate in rural areas, and in the city areas, particularly in the eastern Ukraine, it was Russian and Jewish populations that dominated. So that any policies that the Bolsheviks adopted toward the peasants had an obvious impact on Ukrainians very directly.
With the destruction of the intellectuals and the church well underway, collectivization allows Stalin to break the farmers, the backbone of the nation. Anticipating fierce resistance, he orders the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. Kulak is a Bolshevik label for the wealthier farmers who own 24 acres of land or hire labor. They are considered the potential leaders in any revolt. The state confiscates not only the lands of the farmers, classified as kulaks, but also all their possessions. It is forbidden by law to assist these enemies of the people. Miroslava Vudka was 7 when her father was exiled. She never saw him again.
In the winter of 1931, they came to evict us from our house. Activists, a group of people, if they could be called people, came into the house and looked over everything and made us very frightened. Then they said, "Get out. This isn't your house anymore." But Mother wouldn't leave. "At least let us spend the rest of the winter here," she begged. "Where can I go with these children and old people?" The men picked her up and threw her outside. A militiaman or activist stood in the doorway as a guard. Mother shouted to us, "Children, don't leave the house." There were tears and screams. It was frightening. We grabbed hold of the benches in the house, screaming and refusing to let go. Then the men began to take us out one by one. They would throw one of us outside and then another. Thus, they threw us out of the house, one by one, all 6 of us.
A courageous neighbor risked deportation to give her family shelter. Some farmers burn their crops, kill their livestock, and flee to the cities. But over the next 3 years, 1 million men, women, and children are rounded up, jammed into sealed boxcars, and shipped off to the remotest corners of the Soviet Union. The survivors work as slave labor, producing raw materials for export to the West. This is the end of the line for many of the best farmers and cultural and religious leaders of Ukraine. Young party activists are brought in from the cities to push through collectivization. Anyone who opposes the measures is denounced as a kulak and deported. Yet resistance comes from all quarters. Not so long ago, the Bolsheviks had given land to the poor. Now they want to take it away.
All right, let's go out of Russia because it's depressing, and we're going to go into another depressing one, Italy. Italy became under the control of Benito Mussolini, and Benito Mussolini was a crazy, crazy, crazy man. He is the one who came up with the term fascist, and basically it just means single ruler. He did not like socialism. He did not like communism. And so he said, I'm not going to be either. I'm going to be a fascist. And he came up with this idea. This guy had a lot of over-the-top plans for himself. He wanted to become the next Caesar, and he openly told people that, I'm going to be the next Caesar. And his ambition, as you can see, was to restore the glory of Rome. And his idea was to literally take over all the land masses that Rome ever owned, and that includes Egypt, that includes Turkey, that includes all the Balkans, all of that. He wanted to take all of that and restore the glory of Rome. In order to get what he wanted accomplished, he knew that he had to have the media appear to be on his side, so he is one of the first rulers to ever censor the press. And any story that was to be told, whether it was a magazine or a newspaper article, had to go through him and be okayed before it was allowed to be published. And he used those same newspapers for propaganda, and to blackmail people and terrible, awful things that he came up with to get people on his side. And if you were not willing as a member of the press to do what he asked you to do, then he just took his little secret police called the Black Shirts, and he used them to enforce his decision. So the Black Shirts were his own little military force. Basically, he was so scary that he went to the public officials of Rome and said, "I'm here, I'm taking over," and they said, "Go ahead, we won't fight you." So he was a big, bad, scary guy. Immediately, he began changing society to kind of warp people into his beliefs. And one of the things that he did was about the family and where women should be. He really truly believed that women should be in the kitchen, pregnant, having new little Benito Mussolini soldiers to join the Black Shirts. And he made a rule that the largest number of women allowed in the workforce was to be 10% of the workforce. You definitely were not allowed to work if you were a married woman. And at no point whatsoever were women allowed to make up more than 10% of the workforce, even if there were a lot more single women than that. Too bad. He outlawed divorce. He wanted families to stay together, so you were stuck with each other once you said "I do." And he highly encouraged, men to get married, to the point where he charged them outrageous taxes that would make them lose everything. And pretty much be destitute if they did not get married. So I guess if you were a very unattractive Italian woman at the time, you might love Benito Mussolini, but most people felt like this was just absolutely crossing the line. Basically, you were forcing these men to marry any woman that was willing to marry them. As far as the children go, and this is a Hitler move, the children were taught by his own people. All teachers were removed that were not part of his fascist party, and he basically turned education of our children into like a military training, warping their little minds into believing that he was Caesar and things like that. Benito Mussolini absolutely adored Hitler, thought that he was wonderful. Again and again and again, he and Hitler made plans to take over certain territory or put down a certain group of people, and in return Hitler was supposed to give Mussolini this or that. Benito helped Hitler every single time he was asked to, but Hitler never gave that man anything. He just kept kind of pulling him along and bribing him and then not fulfilling his end of the promise. But Benito liked him and thought that he was a great leader and wanted to be like him and wanted to please him. And this is going to lead to the invasion of Ethiopia. So let's switch to the next slide and you'll see what that's about. In Ethiopia in 1935, he decided that he was going to go in and take over that country because, remember, when all these people started scrambling for Africa, Ethiopia was the one country nobody went after because of them being Christians. So it was okay for him to go after Ethiopia because it wasn't a colony of another country. So that's why he chose Ethiopia. He fought these people for 7 months and used things like chemical weapons and air power. You can see the difference between what he had on the left-hand side of the screen and down there at the bottom, the weapons, the ships. And look at the top picture here of the Ethiopians. That's pretty much what they're like even today. They didn't have a whole lot of anything to defend themselves, but it was a non-stop 7-month campaign basically to wipe out as many as he possibly could, and 30,000 Ethiopians end up dying. And he really kind of did that to prove to Hitler that he was capable of being imperialistic and doing things on his own without Hitler and getting things accomplished. So 30,000 people from Ethiopia had to die because Mussolini had a point to prove to Hitler. That's pretty sad. So in the end, Benito Mussolini is going to get his. Benito Mussolini was captured in 1945 He and his girlfriend, that's his girlfriend hanging beside him. Notice I did not say wife. So he didn't get married. He just preached for other people to get married. They were captured, the couple, and then three of their closest, I guess you could say confidants, were captured. They were shot, and then they were hung upside down in one of the courtyards in Rome, so that people could come by for 3 or 4 days and throw rocks at them and spit on them and throw rotten food at them and whatever they wanted to basically disgrace the dead bodies for a while. Hitler's going to kill himself 3 days later. So a lot of people think that he was afraid of this happening to him. So they, even though Hitler never really did return Mussolini's close friendship feelings for him, his death is definitely going to affect Hitler. So Mussolini is killed in 1945. All right, let's talk about the guy that everybody wants to talk about, Hitler. All right, Hitler, of course, came to rise in Germany when they were suffering from the effects of World War I. Inflation, the Depression, things like that. Hitler did some pretty radical things. One of the things he did was to take that hurt and that desperation that people were feeling, and he turned it into hate. Hate for others and love of Germany. So extreme nationalism, of course, we've learned about that before. And he's going to do things like suspending civil rights so people can't speak out against him. And he's also going to get rid of all the other political parties. So that's kind of the first steps that he takes. He does use these things you see in front of you: terror, repression, totalitarian rule. He uses SS troops to enforce his will, but even though he's doing some pretty radical things and some pretty bad things, people still loved him. They thought that this guy was just the answer to all their prayers. But the question remains as to why. Why would they think that this guy is all that? Here's some of the things that he did. He actually stood up before the world and said, Germany's not going to obey the Treaty of Versailles anymore. It's stupid. He even went out and got back a lot of the land that Germany had lost after World War I. Remember, they had expanded. He went back and got a whole bunch of these people. He created programs that actually worked to give people jobs for the first time in a very long time. His economy was actually starting to work, and people were starting to work. He also said, we're not going to struggle to pay you any money anymore. We're tired of that. And you know what? Germany's going back to her militaristic power. She's going to get her pride back. So it was this guy standing before the Germans saying, we are going to rise up and be the Germany that we used to be. So it's kind of a new thing for these people. They have not heard this in decades. And here's this guy saying, I'm going to stand up for you. All right, so that's all well and good, but here's the question at the bottom of the screen. Why do people trust him and allow him to do the things that he did? Because some of what he did was some pretty evil stuff. So let's look at that. Why was Hitler able to step in? Remember, Germany's in turmoil. They're looking for a solution. You have inflation, you have depression, a democratic government that was weakened, not looking so good. People are angry, and they want somebody to blame. So in steps Hitler with this idea of preaching love of mother country, which leads to extreme nationalism, right? And he also created the socialist government through the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party is preaching extreme nationalism and extreme prejudice as well. Let's find somebody to blame. And of course, the blame is going to fall hugely on the Jews. He's going to create this anti-Semitism attitude. Anti-Semitism means that you're anti-Jew. So the people want somebody to be mad at. Kaiser Wilhelm's long gone. They don't have anybody to blame, and he gives them somebody to blame. And on top of all of that, he's preaching this mother country, and he's telling the Germans and the rest of the world, I'm going to go start reclaiming my land because I'm going to bring my people home. People who consider themselves German are going to come home and be part of Germany. Enough with this splitting them up, Austria, Hungary, two separate countries, all that stupid stuff. I'm bringing my people home. I've had it. So he sounded like this hero, you know. The only thing he was missing was a cape. Here is a picture of Hitler. He is the one in the front row on the bottom right, sitting beside the dog. And supposedly, according to several accounts, when Kaiser Wilhelm announced the surrender of Germany and announced that they were taking full blame for World War I, supposedly Hitler turned to one of his fellow soldiers and said, "I'm taking down the world for this one." So maybe he had it in his head all the way back then in 1918, who knows. But I want to tell you a little bit about his reputation as a soldier in World War I. He was kind of a joke in the beginning. He was a great horse rider. So, you know, no man's land was very, very dangerous. Riding a horse was super, super dangerous. But some guy somewhere, someday, decided that they were going to send Hitler, a young Hitler, to another trench with a message. And they figured that, you know, the message probably isn't going to get there. Even if it does, this guy's not going to make it back. He's dead. Who cares? He's kind of annoying. Who cares? But Hitler does make it back. And the next day they send him with another message thinking he's not going to make it back, but he does. Day after day they do this, and day after day Hitler comes back, sometimes with a scratch or two, but never anything serious. And people start to think that this guy is a superhero, like maybe even has magical powers. So his attitude of I can do anything and this aura of kind of magical, mystical stuff follows him even out of World War I into what's going to happen in the rest of his life. So if you'll click to the next page, kind of slowly go through some of the pictures that I'm going to show you. He was just an ordinary guy. And he showed that side of himself to Germans. He doesn't to the rest of the world, but he does to Germans, which makes him much more likable than we could ever imagine. Down here on the bottom, of course, you have Hitler on a sled. Whoever would have pictured that? He doesn't look super happy. But he's on a sled. You know, how scary is that guy? Not too scary. Then you see a picture of him and his fiancée, bride-to-be 5 minutes after they kill them, 5 minutes before they kill themselves. But Eva Braun was an actress, and she was bubbly and giggly and lively and very well loved by everyone who met her. So he kind of used that persona to get people to trust him because she was so trustworthy. He treated her like crap. He didn't want her to be famous. He didn't want her to be a star. He didn't want her to be the life of the party, but she just was. And he did not like that. They were very mismatched, but she loved him. And having her by his side really got women interested in him because they loved her. So he seemed like a pretty decent guy if Ava was willing to be with him. All right, here at the top you see him laughing. You don't see very many pictures of Hitler laughing. He is with one of his dogs. I cannot remember that dog's name, but he absolutely loved animals. You saw that from the picture of World War I. He always had animals around him. This last picture with the little girl on his lap, that is one of his Hitler Youth victims. I just want to take that little girl and rip her off of his lap and run her to a safe place someplace. I hate that picture. It just creeps me out. Hitler was also kind of melancholy, and he tried to kill himself multiple times throughout his life, but somebody always stopped him. He was personally kind of like a little boy, unsure of himself. He had been denied entrance into the art school in Vienna several times, which totally broke his heart. Tried to kill himself after that first denial. So he wasn't always this big, nasty, horrible man, and he had a tender side. He had a very kind of mushy side where his feelings got hurt, and he let people, the right people, see that so that he seemed human and did not seem like an evil, awful, terrible being to them. All right, so he goes before Germany and says, if we want to be the strong nation like we were under Frederick the Great, we have to purify our country. And we need to purify it with Aryan blood. Aryan blood being that tall, blonde, blue-eyed look. everything he was not. If you remember Aryans from World One, in India, they were the pretty people. They were the ones that came up with the caste system. So not always nice people, but they've always been considered kind of the upper echelon of people, the strong, pretty people. And he says that he needs to turn Germany into that, and he's going to purify it. So this is where he gets that idea of anti-Semitism against the Jews and encourages people to set up concentration camps. He calls them concentration camps, not death camps, where you will concentrate the population of those nasty Jews that have been driving us crazy since Nero's time, who started the bubonic plague and all this other stuff. Let's just concentrate them in little places all over Poland, mostly, and some in Vienna, some in Austria. We'll put them in these different places, concentrate them there, and get them out of our way. He didn't say he was going to kill them. He just said he was going to concentrate them there. So he also targets specific groups in society that he needs on board with this. So let's see the groups that he focuses on. Women is the biggest group. Women were downtrodden in Germany from day one, and Hitler comes in and he's the first male leader to ever say to a woman, "You are important." And he put them on a pedestal as the people who were going to keep the country alive by having children. Every time you had a baby, there was this huge ceremony for all the women who had babies that year, and you would get a pin, and you'd get extra food for your family for a certain period of time. And once you had so many children, you got a plaque, and Hitler might even visit you in your house. And he put women up on this pedestal that they were to be adored and taken care of as mothers of the motherland. And women had never been talked to or about that way in Germany. Remember, it's militaristic. It was a very manly society, and now all of a sudden you have a leader who's saying that, no, our country is only going to survive if we take care of our women. So women were just sucked right into that. And here you have given them medals for having children, called them the saving grace of Germany. You can see the women they want to touch him, because he's like this incredible icon that is actually saying women are worth something, and German women had never heard that before. Even creepier, he's going to go after the youth. So he created this program. It's actually called Hitler's Youth, and of course it's males and females. And he raised these children from very, very small. Throughout their education, they're being told that they're contributing to a cause. The cause being the solidification of Germany and the strength of Germany against the world. He warped their little minds into believing that everybody else on the planet was unworthy, and Germany had to unite and basically take over the world to save the world. So when you're told that as a child, of course you're going to believe it. So the Hitler Youth, that's just, wow, that's cutting below the belt. And don't forget, Mussolini did that as well by removing regular teachers from school, and putting his people in to preach to the children, whatever he wanted them to learn. If you're told that your whole youth, then you're going to believe it as an adult. That was kind of the plan Hitler and Mussolini both had. All right, Germany also, under Hitler, knew which countries to approach for which promises. So he allied himself, of course, with Italy and Japan, but he also went after Russia. He was afraid of Russia. He knew that Russia in the past was a very aggressive country before Tsar Nicholas. Stalin was definitely a force to be reckoned with, and he didn't want to have to worry about him. So he went to Stalin and created this Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. And basically it was a pledge not to attack each other. Now, Hitler's not going to keep his promise. He's actually going to invade Russia and break his promise. But I got to give this to Stalin. Stalin never broke his promise. He defended his men against Hitler's onslaught, yes, but he never chased Hitler. He never invaded Germany. He never declared war on him. In fact, Stalin did not declare war in World War II until after Hiroshima. So 2 days before the war ended, he finally declared war on Japan. He never declared it on Germany. So he kept that promise alive all those years, even though Hitler absolutely broke his promise. All right, let's move on to Japan. Japan was this little tiny innocent country until they decided that they would open their gates to Matthew Perry. And once Matthew Perry opened their gates, Japan realized that they either had to eat other countries or be eaten. So they became imperialistic, and they were smart enough to figure out what sources or resources they needed and where they were. What places do we need to take over? We don't want to take over the world. We just want to take over places that we need to fulfill our personal needs. So here you have the list. Korea in 1910, Manchuria in 1931, and then China in 1937. They had resources that they needed. Japan does not have a lot of natural resources. So like I said, they went after parts of the world that would help them fulfill their own needs. Now, the guy you see in front of you is a military leader during all of this, Hideki Tojo. And Tojo is actually going to be the guy in charge during World War II. He's the military guy in charge. All right, let's take a little bit more of a look at Japan. Hirohito, Emperor Hirohito, was actually supposed to be the guy in charge. As far as society looked at it, he was the guy in charge. He's the emperor. He was always portrayed as this great warrior. He was kept very separate from the world, almost hidden. You only saw him from afar on his white horse as a warrior. Tojo, whose title was Prime Minister of Japan, he was actually the real leader. And as scary as it is, here you have Mussolini, who adored Hitler and everything about him. So did Tojo. Tojo thought that Hitler knew where it was at and how to make a country strong, and actually tried to be like him. Now, remember, he's the guy that authorized the invasion of Manchuria, Korea, and China, and he's the one who gave the word to drop the bombs at Pearl Harbor. So Japan had a history. As soon as World War I was over, they really started clamoring for things that they needed. And some of the places that they took over actually belonged to Germany and China. And they got all the raw materials that they needed to industrialize. That was their whole thing. They wanted to be like the West, only better. So they did industrialize. The key to their success, unlike everybody else in the world, they realized from the very beginning that if they wanted to succeed and not fall into that trap of going down with all the other people you're connected to, they could never borrow or lend money to anybody, and they did not. So Japan did not go through a depression. It's one of the very few places on the planet that did not go through the depression because they didn't owe anybody money and nobody owed them money. So they were just kind of their own little private entity doing their own little thing. So there's Japan. Let's move on to China. All right, we're going to talk about two people in China, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. Those of you who some of you might remember that Mao used to actually be spelled with a T. It's been changed in the last few years. But Chiang Kai-shek is a member of the Nationalist Party, so it's kind of not truly democratic, but it's Republican, so there's voting going on. And then Mao as a communist member. Let's hear their story. All right, so Chiang Kai-shek, here you see in 1925, he became the leader of the Nationalist Party. You might have heard it called the Kuomintang in China. And this party pushes for democracy, nationalism, social reform, things like that. He decided to try to unify China by eliminating communists from his country. And this has been done a lot throughout history. Remember that they also did it to the Armenians in Turkey in World War I, the Armenian genocide. They thought if they killed the Christians and the whole country was Muslim, it would unify them. Well, this is kind of that same idea, only it's on political field here. So we're going to get rid of all the communists, and we're going to unify the country that way. So he takes over in 1925. By 1926, there's hardly any communists left. So those who are left, in order to escape death, basically, they went on what has become known as the Long March, and I'll show you a map of that here in a minute. But it was an 8,000-mile march across China, And it started with 100,000 men, women, and children. Remember, they got to take their families with them. So 100,000 men, women, and children start on the march, but only 30,000 make it to the end. So 70,000 people will die on that march, and they blame Chiang Kai-shek for it. So Chiang actually set up his government in Nanjing, and that's where he worked on roads, he improved education, he brought Confucius ways back. So here's the side that his people see as he's bringing this country together and doing great things, but behind the walls he was chasing down communists and murdering them, even children, as long as they were their family members were considered communist. He was taking them down too. So when the Japanese invaded in 1937, Chiang was forced to join forces with the communists. The communists were good at strategy. He was not so much. His military was not very organized. By 1937, the communists that were left were pretty well organized. So he turns to them for help. And after World War II now, the Chinese communists fought against the nationalists and were victorious. So they fought their own people. Chiang ran to Taiwan, and Mao Zedong took control of the Chinese mainland. So he actually takes his nationalist government and heads to Taiwan. So China actually has two separate governments. We, of course, recognize Taiwan. All right, here's a map of the Long March. You can see that it's not straight. That's because they were trying to lose people. The people that were chasing them and killing them. So they're not going to do a straight line. They were trying to avoid capture. And again, that's an 8,000-mile march. All right, the fifth country that we're going to talk about is still China. Sorry, I thought we were starting a new one. I'm tired. So China, we're still in China, and this is China under Mao. Mao, of course, was one of the leaders on the Long March across China, and he saw a lot of his own people die. So he vowed revenge. And when Chiang was run out of China into Taiwan, Mao's going to step right into his shoes, and he is going to be the leader of the People's Republic of China. So all of a sudden, it has a new name. It's not just China. It's the People's Republic of China, and it's communist. The problem was Mao did not know how to be a communist. So he came up with these plans that, wow, were not really communist. It was more of a crazy man stepping in and just doing really weird things with his people. So the first program he came up with was called the Great Leap Forward. And he, like Stalin, decided that he was going to collectivize farms. And by what he did was he made you have a family member. Each family had to have at least one member, usually a child, that was part of this collective program. And you went and lived, if you're one of these people, you went and lived on one of Mao's farms out in the middle of nowhere. And you were supposed to grow food to feed the rest of the people. And it was like slavery. While you were there, you followed very, very strict rules. You were made to memorize Mao's Little Red Book, which if you ever get a chance to read it, because it completely contradicts itself over and over and over again. It's very confusing. But kids had to memorize that, like memorize it, and they were constantly tested on it. They would be pulled out of the field randomly and asked, what's line 5 on page 10? And if they didn't know it, they would beat them or tie them to a pole and make them sit in the sun all day with no food. And it wasn't good. And the thing is that it did not increase the production of food at all. Between the people that died of starvation and the people who died on the farms, about 30 million people lost their lives because of the Great Leap Forward. Now, while that was going on, he had another program for the city people called the Cultural Revolution. And what that involved was a group called the Red Guard. And the Red Guard was mostly children. Again, everybody's going after the kids, I guess. Mostly children were randomly selected to be a member of the Red Guard. And you would get a message delivered to you saying that you had been chosen and you were to pass a test And basically, they would give you the name of somebody to publicly out as a traitor. And they would watch you prior to this to make sure that the person that you had to out was somebody that meant something to you. I mean, this had to be like it's a trial. So you can't just be told, hey, go out that guy that you see walking across the street. This is going to be somebody that means something to you. So there's a story in a very old story about a little girl who was told that she had to out her favorite teacher. And the message was delivered to her in class early in the morning. And at lunchtime, the little girl was to go out onto the playfield and start screaming that this teacher was a traitor to the country. And she did it with tears streaming down her face. She did it. And they dragged the teacher off the playground into the street and beat her to death in front of this little girl. And it was the little girl's fault. But that was the trial, that the test that they had to go through to be a member of the Red Guard. And that craziness led to another 40 million people being killed. So Mao never really understood what communism was about. He thought it would be peasants who were going to rise up, not the working class. So he felt like he could work these people to death, and the peasants were somehow going to come along and fix things. And that's, of course, not going to happen. But he did increase technology, and he definitely enhanced the cultural pleasures in China. He loved plays and had them performed regularly. His wife was kind of in charge of that. And the plays that he and she endorsed or created back then are still performed today as kind of a way to honor him. They still honor him. They don't see him as a horrible man. They honor him as a great leader, even though he killed over 70 million of their own people. They remember him in a very different way than most countries might remember a leader that did that. But Mao was, he was different. But he did do things that improved the economy through technology. So they allowed him to do some of the crazy things that he did. Now we're going to talk about a good guy. We're going to move into India. We've talked about India quite a bit in the past. And this guy Gandhi, who was actually a lawyer, believe it or not, in an earlier life, Gandhi decided that he wanted to get the British out of India. Remember, the British have done some pretty nasty things in there. The Sepoy Rebellion, they were growing opium there so that they could illegally sell it to China. They've done some really bad things, and he wants them out. But he's not a violent person. So rather than throwing people out, he tells the people of India, let's get rid of this violent attitude, and the change in our country will be peace. So we're going to develop something called the Indian Independence Movement. That means independence from Britain. And in that little group, they emphasize civil disobedience and passive resistance. So it's a couple of ways of saying to your controllers, we're not going to do what you want us to do, but it's not violent. You're simply saying, no, I'm not going to buy your goods anymore. Or I'm not going to pay this bill, or I'm not going to sit when you tell me to sit, I'm going to stand instead. You're not beating anybody, you're not blowing anything up, you're just peacefully saying, nope, I'm not going to do that, and moving on with your day. So it's a very different kind of attitude than people were used to. We've talked a lot about the bad guys like Stalin, Mussolini, Lenin, Hitler, but what we call the good guys doing during all of this, like FDR and Churchill and all the other leaders of all the other good countries, and I'm using quotes here, the good countries. Basically, they weren't doing anything. Europe was tired. Britain and France did not want to have another war. So whatever Hitler does during that interwar period, they just kind of ignore it. They practice something called appeasement. So, in other words, they just repeatedly let him keep doing whatever he wants to do in hopes that, he'll come to his senses, he'll stop taking land, he can't take over the world, right? And we'll just stay peaceful because we're letting him get whatever he wants. It's like taking a kid to the grocery store and, they start screaming for a cupcake, so you buy him the cupcake to shut him up. I really hate it when I see parents do that in the grocery store. But that's what this is, and Hitler's allowed to basically do whatever he wants. And I love this cartoon because if you look on the headboard, you can see all the names of all the territory that he's just slowly taking over. and everybody's letting them, like he's Santa stuffing them in the bag for himself. And that's basically what Britain and France were doing, just appeasing Hitler. But what about America? What was America doing? America was practicing isolationism and pacifism. So, under the terms of isolationism, you worry about your inner selves, what's happening to your people at home. We had just fought a war too. We didn't want to go back to Europe. A lot of people were saying, we don't care what happens over there. We did our deed. It was horrible. Our guys are home now. We're not getting mixed up in their problems anymore. So let's just pretend it's not happening and move on with our lives. And then, of course, that pacifist idea of just, we're peaceful people. We don't want to be involved in a war. We're not bad. It's not about us wanting to save our own butts. It's about not wanting to kill each other. So isolationism versus pacifism is what America was doing. So basically, nobody was doing anything that could have done something during this interwar period. This isn't really part of the unit, and you definitely don't have to take notes on it, but the next 4 slides are basically things from Dr. Seuss. He was one of the people that wasn't willing to just stand back and accept what was going on. He wanted America to be aware of it and stop being isolationist, and he brought this awareness about through cartoons and through humor. And, we do a lot of Dr. Seuss stuff now and directed at children, but it wasn't really always directed at children. He did a lot of stuff directed at adults. And sometimes he did it in the form of children's stories, and we weren't totally aware of what he was doing. But I love this one, the ostrich bonnet, to bury your head in the sand and not be aware of what's going on. Here, of course, there's a lot of racism going on during this time period. World War I, still segregated units, really bad things happening because of racism. And America just basically told everybody, straighten up, stop being racist. And he's making it look like it's just that easy. You can get the racial prejudice bug out of your ear just by Uncle Sam telling you to get it out. So I thought that was kind of a neat cartoon too. And then, of course, the U-boats made the Germans seem so evil during World War I, and now the United States is going to be doing it too. We're just like them kind of thing. This is my favorite, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but they were foreign children, so it didn't really matter. And that, to me, is just the epitome of Dr. Seuss getting his point across, that there were innocent people dying all over the place, and we were allowing it to happen because they weren't us and for no other reason. So I know it was a very long unit, the interwar period, but hopefully you learned a lot of new stuff, and I will see you in the next unit in World War II.